What if the very first race of the 2026 Formula One season has already triggered a major FIA investigation? Mercedes arrived in Melbourne and delivered what looked like the perfect start. Pole position, dominant race pace, and a crushing 1-2 finish with George Russell and Kimi Antonelli. But within hours of the Australian Grand Prix ending, rival teams began digging into the data. Acceleration traces, hybrid deployment patterns, energy recovery cycles. And according to engineers across the paddock, the numbers coming out of the Mercedes power unit didn't just look fast. They looked unusual. Some analysts now believe the Mercedes engine could be producing up to 30 horsepower more than certain rivals. Others think the real secret might be hidden in how Mercedes deploys electrical energy under the brand new 2026 regulations. Which is exactly why several teams have reportedly pushed the FIA to take a closer look at the system that dominated Melbourne. Because the gap in the first race was not small. Ferrari admitted they were nowhere near the Mercedes pace during the weekend. Red Bull finished more than 50 seconds behind the winner. And when numbers like that appear in the very first race of a new regulation era, Formula One starts asking difficult questions. Did Mercedes simply build the best power unit for the new rules? Or did they discover something hidden inside the regulations that the rest of the grid completely missed? Because if the FIA decides to expand this investigation after the evidence from the Australian Grand Prix, the 2026 season may have already started with the biggest technical controversy in Formula One. The 2026 Formula One season officially began in Melbourne. After months of testing, speculation, and preparation, the entire grid finally arrived at Albert Park for the first real test of the new era. New regulations had changed almost everything in the sport. New power units, more electrical energy, less traditional combustion power. For the teams, this season represents a complete reset. Nobody truly knew who had interpreted the new rules correctly. Testing had given some hints, but testing is never the full picture in Formula One. Fuel loads are hidden. Engine modes are restricted. Teams rarely reveal their true performance before the first race. The Australian Grand Prix is where the real pace finally begins to appear. And almost immediately, Mercedes started attracting attention. From the first practice session, the W17 looked incredibly comfortable on track. George Russell appeared calm behind the wheel. The car looked balanced through the medium-speed corners of Albert Park. Stable under braking. But the most impressive detail appeared when the Mercedes exited slow corners. The traction looked incredibly clean. Other drivers were fighting wheel spin and instability. The Mercedes simply launched forward. At first, rival teams assumed Mercedes might simply be running a lighter fuel load during practice. That explanation is common in Formula One. Teams often hide their true pace until qualifying. But that theory started to disappear during the final practice session. Russell produced a lap that immediately caught the attention of engineers across the paddock. More than 0.6 faster than the closest Ferrari. In modern Formula One, a gap like that during practice already raises eyebrows. But the real moment of truth arrived the next day. March 7th. Qualifying for the Australian Grand Prix. This is when every team finally removes the limits. Maximum engine power. Maximum hybrid deployment. Everything the car can deliver in a single lap. And when Russell pushed the Mercedes to the limit, the W17 suddenly looked even stronger. The car rotated beautifully through the corners. The balance looked almost perfect. And the traction in the final sector of Albert Park was exceptional. Then the timing screens confirmed what many engineers were already starting to suspect. George Russell had taken pole position. 1 minute 18 seconds and 518 thousandths. But the next result made the message even clearer. Second place. Kimi Antonelli. Another Mercedes. The entire front row belonged to the same team. And what made Antonelli's performance even more impressive was what had happened earlier that same day. During the final practice session, the young Italian had suffered a heavy crash exiting turn 2. The rear of the Mercedes stepped out violently. The car slammed into the barriers. For a moment, it looked like his weekend might be over before qualifying even began. But the mechanics worked quickly and rebuilt the car in time. Antonelli returned to the track and delivered a remarkable lap that secured second place on the grid. Inside the paddock, that front row lockout immediately raised questions. Ferrari had expected to fight for pole. Red Bull had hoped to be much closer. But the gap to the Mercedes was larger than many people anticipated. Charles Leclerc later admitted something very direct after qualifying. Ferrari was simply nowhere near the pace of the Mercedes in Melbourne. And according to him, the advantage appeared to come mainly from the engine performance. Statements like that are extremely unusual in Formula One. Drivers rarely admit such a clear performance gap publicly. But the numbers from qualifying made the situation impossible to ignore. Still, qualifying pace is only one part of the story. Because in Formula One, the real test of any car comes on Sunday. Race conditions, fuel loads, tire management, energy deployment across long stints. And when the lights finally went out for the Australian Grand Prix, the race began to reveal just how strong the Mercedes package truly was. When the lights went out in Melbourne, the race almost began in the worst possible way for Mercedes. Both drivers had locked out the front row in qualifying. Everything looked perfectly prepared. But the start changed everything. George Russell hesitated for a split second. Kimi Antonelli struggled even more with traction. And that tiny moment was enough for Ferrari to attack. Charles Leclerc launched brilliantly from the second row. By the time the cars reached the first corner, the Ferrari was already in the lead. For a few laps, the entire race looked completely different from what most people expected. Russell suddenly found himself trapped between the two Ferraris. Leclerc ahead, Lewis Hamilton closing quickly behind. The opening phase of the race turned into a tense battle for control. And under the new 2026 regulations, that battle was even more complicated. Because the new hybrid systems deliver power in short bursts. Drivers can activate aggressive deployment modes to attack. But every time that extra electrical power is used, the battery drains faster. Which means the car becomes vulnerable a few seconds later. Russell experienced that immediately. Every time he activated attack mode to challenge Leclerc, the Mercedes surged forward with impressive acceleration. But seconds later, when the battery level dropped, Leclerc could fight back. Overtake. Counterattack. Then another attempt. For several laps, the lead of the Australian Grand Prix changed hands repeatedly. It was intense racing. Exactly the kind of competition Formula One hoped the new rules would create. But then the moment arrived that quietly changed the entire race. A Red Bull suddenly slowed with a mechanical problem. The car stopped on the side of the track. Race control deployed the virtual safety car. At first, it looked like a simple interruption. But inside the Mercedes garage, the reaction was immediate. Both Russell and Antonelli were called into the pits at the exact same moment. A perfectly synchronized double pit stop. Fresh tires. Minimal time lost while the field was slowed. Ferrari made a different decision. They stayed out on track. Their strategy was based on probability. Albert Park often produces multiple safety cars. They believed another interruption would likely happen later in the race. But that decision carried enormous risk. And within seconds, the entire race order changed. Russell rejoined the circuit with something every Formula One driver dreams about. Clean air. No traffic ahead. No Ferrari blocking his pace. Just open track. And that is when the real strength of the Mercedes W17 started to appear. Lap after lap, Russell began controlling the race from the front. He was not pushing aggressively. He did not need to. The car simply had the pace to manage the gap. Meanwhile, Kimi Antonelli began his recovery. After the poor start, the young Italian had fallen all the way to 7th place. But slowly, lap after lap, he started moving forward again. And during those overtakes, one particular detail began to appear again and again. Every time the Mercedes exited a slow corner, it accelerated slightly earlier than the cars around it. Not dramatically faster, but consistently faster. Corner after corner. Lap after lap. By the middle of the race, Antonelli had already climbed back into podium contention. From that moment forward, the result began to look inevitable. George Russell controlled the race from the front. Kimi Antonelli secured second place behind him. And when the checkered flag finally waved in Melbourne, Mercedes had achieved the perfect result. First place for Russell. Second place for Antonelli. A dominant 1-2 finish in the first race of the 2026 season. On the surface, it looked like the perfect beginning of a new championship campaign. But once the race ended, something else started happening inside the paddock. Because engineers from several teams began studying the telemetry from the race. Acceleration traces. Energy deployment patterns. Hybrid system behavior. And what they discovered inside that data would soon raise serious questions across Formula One. But the most important part of the story began after the checkered flag. Because once the race finished, the real analysis started. Inside Formula One, every team studies the telemetry from every session. Not only their own data. They also analyze the behavior of rival cars. Acceleration curves. Energy deployment maps. Battery discharge patterns. Throttle application. Thousands of data points from every lap. And when engineers began studying the data from the Australian Grand Prix, something unusual appeared in the Mercedes numbers. Not a single strange moment. A pattern. Every time the Mercedes exited a slow corner, the car seemed to accelerate slightly earlier than its rivals. Not dramatically faster, but consistently faster. Corner after corner. Lap after lap. That pattern immediately caught attention inside several garages. Because the 2026 power unit regulations have changed the way performance works in Formula One. Less reliance on combustion power. Much more reliance on electrical deployment and energy recovery. That means the timing of energy delivery is now one of the most important engineering challenges in the sport. Release the electrical energy too early, and the battery drains quickly. Release it too late, and the driver loses acceleration when exiting corners. Most teams are still trying to find the perfect balance. But Mercedes appeared to have solved that puzzle from the very first race. And that is exactly why questions began spreading through the paddock. Some engineers believe the Mercedes power unit may have discovered a smarter way to control hybrid deployment. Not necessarily more raw power, but better timing, better efficiency, power delivered exactly when the driver needs it most. Albert Park exposed that advantage perfectly. The circuit is full of short acceleration zones and slow corners where traction is critical. Under those conditions, the Mercedes looked incredibly efficient. Some analysts inside Formula One now believe the Mercedes power unit could have an advantage close to 30 horsepower compared to certain rivals. 30 horsepower in Formula One is a massive difference. That kind of advantage changes everything. Acceleration out of corners, overtaking ability, defending position on straights. It even helps with tire management because drivers do not need to push as aggressively. But here is where the situation becomes even more complicated. Because several teams believe the advantage might not come purely from engine power. Instead, they suspect something deeper inside the way the hybrid system interacts with the combustion engine. Possibly a clever interpretation of the new regulations. Some engineers believe it could involve compression ratios combined with hybrid deployment timing. A very small technical detail. But in Formula One, small details can create enormous performance advantages. Nothing illegal has been proven. And no official accusation has been made. But when several teams begin asking the same technical questions, the FIA usually begins to pay attention. And according to people inside the paddock, that process has already started after the Australian Grand Prix. Several teams have reportedly requested technical clarification about aspects of the Mercedes power unit.